Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the second session in the Justice Room at OFC 2022. It's really great to have you all here. My name is Mark Walton. I'm Director at Shared Assets, and this is a session looking at how do we change the land system. So a little question to get us thinking on this Thursday morning. We all want to see, and I'm guessing this is why you're all here, a more equitable, just, and sustainable land system. But the big question is, how do we bring that about? And if any of you were at yesterday's Theory of Change workshop, we had a great few hours thinking about the different ways and the different approaches that people do take and might take to creating a more just system. So this session is going to look particularly at sort of two different approaches broadly to making that happen. We've got Francis Northrop from the New Economics Foundation, who will share some of the learning from the recent Land for Who project that explored the potential or the desirability of thinking about establishing a land reform commission for England. And Bonnie van der Steeg will share the work of the People's Land Policy, which is very much about sort of bottom up, developing land reform from the ground up, as the name might suggest. So we'll be hearing from both Francis and Bonnie shortly. If you would all like to introduce yourselves, I see these people are beginning to in the chat. That would be brilliant. We get a sense of who you are, where you are as well, and your interest in this topic as well. I'll just introduce sort of the rest of the team who are helping to make this session happen. So we've got Jana on tech. If you want to give a wave, Jana. Oh, your video's off. But if you want to, thank you. If you need any, if you've got any tech questions, you can message Jana directly in the chat. And we've got a fair team of folks here from Shared Assets who are going to be helping with kind of note taking and joining you in breakout rooms later. So we've got Kim, Alana, Kate, Christabel, and Tom here. Kate's also going to be kind of helping to moderate the chat. So you might be chatting to Kate in the chat. And we have just want to draw your attention as well to the kind of code of conduct for OFC and for the Justice Room. Obviously, we may well disagree with each other about all kinds of things over the course of the next couple of days, but if we can do that in a respectful way and follow the behaviour guide, which I think Jana will put in the chat with kind of information about kind of how we want to treat each other over the next couple of days. So please respect that, and if you do have any issues over the course of this session, then Dora is here to work with you on any kind of like well-being issues. If anything happens that's out of order and makes you feel uncomfortable, then please get in contact with Dora directly. So I think that's probably it for most of the intros. This session is being recorded. It will be made available after the session or after the conference, and we will be making presentations available as well. So I think there's a lot of information going to be in the 2 slide presentations. So we'll be making sure that that's available to you. So I think we're going to kick off with Francis. So Francis Northrop is an Associate Fellow for Local Economies at the New Economics Foundation. She's led the recent Land for Who project, which is led by NEF, looking at the potential for a land commission for England, and is going to share some of that work and maybe some of the broader work that she and NEF have been involved in with colleagues. So I'm going to hand over to you, Francis. And there'll be 2 presentations. We're going to have time for a little bit of Q&A after the presentations, or put questions in the chat so that we can pick them up later. And there'll be some breakout sessions as well, so you can reflect on some of the presentations in small groups. So Francis, over to you.
Lovely, thanks Mark. Hello everybody, it's really good to be here. Just before I start the presentation, because I am mostly going to talk about the research that we did with shared assets around the Land for Who question and an English Land Commission, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about how that kind of came about in my mind, because it was me at NEF who went to the funder to speak to them about maybe doing something of that ilk. And so I'm talking to you from my bedroom in Totnes in Devon, and I moved here about 10 years ago to manage Transition Town Totnes. I can see there's people on the call that I know and who are supporters down here, which is great. And I have to confess that although I'd always been involved in community development and sort of community-led approaches to things, it wasn't until I worked for Transition Town and we started to look at how we build resilience that I realised how critical land was to everything. So we sort of did this local economic blueprint where we looked at how we could create livelihoods for people around, food growing and health and care, and around retrofitting houses and renewable energy. And at the heart of all of that was, if we didn't have access to the land, then it was totally impossible, which led me to become a director of Atmos Totnes, which is a project, a community benefit society that is looking at bringing forward an ex-milk processing plant down by the station in Totnes, so that we can bring forward quite a lot of those things that we needed to do 10 years ago and still need to do. That's another story, you can look it up, it's still ongoing. But it's just that I kind of wanted to set that context, because I think that's true of a lot of people, that they don't see when they're involved in all kinds of different things around justice and different campaigns and different projects and practice, they don't see how fundamental the land is to all of that. And until we all kind of work together on that, then it's really quite difficult to progress anything. So that's what led me to talk to Chris at Shed for the Necessity Fund, who already fund shared assets. And so it was a natural kind of decision to work with shared assets on this. So this question about a land commission obviously comes up regularly. Scotland, there was relative success up there, but also obviously a much more kind of sympathetic and policy context, but still, lots of work to be done. And so what we really wanted to understand was not just kind of what would it look like to set up a commission that's the same as the one in Scotland, but not only what would the commission look like, but even is a commission desirable in the context that we're currently in England. And so we designed the research in a way that would enable us to kind of be generative as we went along, and to kind of really involve the people who we were talking to, but also expand the team out, because we were aware that although shared assets and NEF have both got a really good track record in land and land understanding land justice, what actually is necessary is to just be much more kind of diverse and representative in the groups of people who are actually speaking and researching. And so within the constraints of the funding that we had, what we did is, in the first instance, we just did a desk research piece of looking at a summary of findings, and there's a link in this, there's links in throughout this presentation that you can click on and see, and when you receive it you can look at those. And we looked at these particular reports, all extremely good, all really good conclusions within them. We summarised each of those, and that's all there for us to look at, and we reflected on that, and then we put together questions for the next stage of the research. So within those recommendations, things on data and transparency, legal reform, tax and fiscal reform, land use frameworks, ownership planning reform, all of those things were really, really critically important. And I think we all know those things, and those things keep getting repeated in all the different policy documents that come out on reports. And it's not that those aren't helpful, that every single one moves us along, but the one that really stands out is the one about changing the narrative, not just about land, but about who is involved in land and who we hear and listen to as part of that. I just wanted to share this really good piece out of a report that was Power in Place. If you haven't seen it, I think you download it from the Shared Assets website. Thanks, Kate. But this particular graph really, image really stood out to me, that basically the people who have an active role in the current land narrative, people who are passive within that, and the people who are absent within it, it's the people who are absent within it that we need to hear from. It's just utterly fundamental. I know what this this whole room is about, the whole of the conference. But the more we keep saying this, the more we keep talking about it, and the more we're networking, the better it will be. And so what we did was some structured interviews with people who are at like the rock face of trying to make change, campaigning, practice, and land justice. And we worked with 3 co-researchers. So we did an open recruitment for co-researchers, and we worked with 3 excellent researchers. Look them up as well, because they're really, really interesting in their own right, doing some really interesting things, and are great researchers. Sarah Chiseco, Grace Brown, and Deborah Broomfield. And we went out and spoke to those groups that we felt had something that they were doing, which really sort of brought something important to the land narrative that we don't hear when we talk about like kind of lofty sort of land commissions and people sat on panels and looking at particular things. So we spoke to the people involved in Reclaim Holloway, around reclaiming Holloway Women's Prison from the Ministry of Justice, trying to make that into a community-led development that works for the people who live there and really honours the women and the violence that they were subjected to as part of the prison. East Marsh United, which are an estate in Grimsby, where people there are buying up houses from rogue landlords and doing them up using like skilling up young local people and then renting them fairly on a fair rent. People's Land Policy, you'll hear from Bonnie in a minute. Spring to Life and Joy de Vive Ventures, 2 projects in Birmingham where people are using the outdoors for therapeutic uses and enabling people to be out in the fresh air. Salford Council and how they're dealing with developers and planners, and how planners are trying to kind of mitigate the worst excesses of that within Salford. Kyondo were a community-led engagement and participation organisation in Birmingham, and Traveller Pride, which was founded by Tyler Hatwell, and talks very much about how the intersections of the need for justice for travelling people, but also with the Kill the Bill and the new policing crime bill and how that affects everybody, which was also resonated by Nikki from Disabled People Against the Cuts, who is also a member of Extinction Rebellion and another austerity movements and NHS cuts. So seeing that all of those things are synonymous with each other. And that was true also with the Black Land and Spatial Justice Project, Decolonising Economics. This idea that basically land is about extraction and the colonial extractivism, and if we're not acknowledging that, then we're not going to get very much further. So the Land Workers Alliance, the River Roading Trust and Cornwall County Farms, who are taking a very different approach to land stewardship and management in the commons. And so we then had a sounding board session with interviewees. We synthesised the findings, and then these findings were drawn together for us, not in a report, but in this really nice interactive diagram. So I'm just going to share that. And so the link to this we can share as well. But effectively, what it's saying is that land is connected to everything, but we're not all connected to the land with each other, and we're disconnected from the land physically, practically, financially, and spiritually. That structural inequality along lines of race, class, gender, disability, immigration status, health, and other forms of marginalisation and their intersections impacts who owns, has access, manages, makes decisions, and gets to have a positive relationship with land. And, just going back to the Power in Place report, it really is that legislation, policy, and funding decisions obviously all benefit people with land. It was also pointed out that even funders tend to prioritise funding to people who already have privilege, even if they are working on land justice issues, and that's something that is also really important to look at. This lack of transparency, we don't know who owns the land and is incredibly unaccountable. Too often land that's available is of poor environmental quality, so we're left with having to deal with ex-brownfield sites like down in Totnes, or like travellers have to live on land that's next to motorways or next to industrial estates. So who has access to healthy land and who doesn't is a real issue of power. And then our movements are fractured and they're siloed. So, you know, if we're focusing on food, it's really positive that this is the farming conference and that, you know, there's a diversity of people in this, in all these sessions, but we really need to be talking more across our different movements. And we are all competing for resources. We're missing information and often lacking in trust. And that this is part of the design of the dominant system. So it's not that we're all not trying our hardest to do the best that we can, but the heavy concrete of the way things are, which is, you know, part of what this image is, makes it hard to even imagine the alternatives. And extraction and exploitation are often the basis for these relationships between people and nature and prop up this artificial separation. But despite this, people are resisting and they're embedding logics of care and stewardship into the land, the relationship with the land around them. And there are wonderful examples of communities bursting through the concrete. So that's what this illustration is. It's this, you know, this whole ecosystem under the underground of amazing things happening. And these things include occupying space on land, then seeking planning permission, stewarding land while proving social benefit, practicing ancestral traditions, thinking about, you know, centering spiritual relationships of working with the land rather than extracting from it, and taking ownership of lands to take out the profit motive. There's so much going on beneath the surface. There's so much energy and potential in the ground. So what we're saying now is that we need to crack open this dominant narrative, but recognize that it's a long process, that change moves at the pace of trust. And we need to aerate the soil with ideas, resources, information and facts, and connect people up like the mycelium supporting the grass and the tree and the flower roots. And we need to tell new stories about what's possible. And so the next stages for us with the project are to work with Untelevised, which is a collaboration between Fisayo from Philanthropy and Mona from Revoke, which is an organisation that works with newly arrived child refugees to put together podcasts that effectively have a format which is to learn. So there's a point where people are learning things, then there's a discussion between a couple of people who understand things. So it's likely we'll bring back in people that we've interviewed, and then there's some sharing about what people can do next. And we're focusing on these 4 topics. So land and movements, land and belonging, land and healing, and land and abundance. What we really want to be able to do is use that as just a helpful kind of background to other work that's going on. So we don't want this to stand in isolation, which is, you know, part of why we're sharing it today and why we're working together with Shared Assets and all the work that they're doing with partners to make sure that this stuff is starting to get out into the mainstream. We're talking about it more and more. And that the question of having an English Land Commission isn't one that will go away and people will still want to do it. And there is a question of how we might do that, but it's really worth saying that the people we spoke to didn't really like the idea of a commission. The idea of a commission seems kind of like outdated and very top down. And they really didn't like the idea of it being called an English Land Commission. You know, the idea that it's English had so many different and really negative connotations for lots of different reasons for people. And so that's something we also really need to think about. So yeah, there's my contact details and Kate's. And like I said, I'll share the slides and they've got lots of links in them. And if you want to follow up on any of this, please do. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Frances. So we've got a few minutes now before we move on to Bonnie. So if anyone has any questions specifically for Frances in relation to the work that she's just shared, you can either put them in the chat and Kate will pick them up, or if you want to put your hand up, go to the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen and you can raise your hand there. If you want to jump in and share your question in person.
The question there from Alison about what was it about a commission that was unpopular?
Yeah, I mean, Kim and Kate can also speak to this, but my impression was that definitely commissions are, I think people feel like they come and go, you know, and nothing really changes. And so that, and are top down. But the English thing, I think, particularly if you speak to people in Wales or Scotland, even, or in Northern Ireland, even in our small, you know, United Kingdom, there is a definite negative image of England, and definitely to do with colonialism. It's not a word that really kind of instills confidence in people. I don't know, Kim, do you want to add anything, or Kate?
Yeah, I think there's also just that recognition of one of the real challenges with land stuff in England. So recognizing that England is kind of a bit of a special case, and that it doesn't have its own parliament or devolved assembly, but that people tend not to, like, they might identify with the region, or like the bits of England are so different from each other. I think there's maybe some skepticism that something that's about the whole country could have an impact. But I think that's still from my point of view, that's still an open question of, like, yeah, what would an English Land Commission need to look like in order to actually do, in order to actually have the impact that we might want it to have.
Yeah, I think there's also something very ingrained in the English context in particular, I think, around the connection between land and the establishment and power. And therefore, you know, and the commissions tend to be peopled by the people who already have the power and are part of that establishment. So I think there's a skepticism as well about the ability of that kind of mechanism, because of the way that it works within our system, to really affect radical change.
There's suddenly a flurry of really good questions in the chat.
Just take a couple. We've got a bit of time.
So I think maybe there's Francis, you might want to talk a little bit more about this change happens at the pace of trust comment, because that it seems to have really resonated with people, and maybe to talk about, like, the narrative change stuff, like, and I fill in a bit on that from the power in place stuff, if that's helpful. There's also a question about why we should pursue a further connection with ancestors and tradition, which you might want to touch on.
Yeah, I think it's connected. So around trust, and so I'm acutely aware doing this work, and was acutely aware when we're designing the methodology for the research, is that I despite, you know, being a Northerner and from originally a working class family, I now, you know, I'm buying a house, and I am, you know, one of those privileged people, and I'm also white, so I have a privilege that other people don't, and so I think that we need to be, if we're going to move forward as a sort of land justice movement, there has to be an acknowledgement that there's this hierarchy of access to funds, to resources, to language, to, you know, all kinds of different things, that if we don't have those conversations, we're not going to create the world that we want to see. Like, we have to embody the world that we want to see. And so we have to be able to trust each other and step back if it's not our place to do something. That was my translation of what the trust question is. And also there's often, going to what Mark said, there's often a kind of a snobbery about people who are doing things in think tanks. I mean, I found my way into NEF by accident, almost, like, you know, my colleague, I was working on the ground here in Totnes, and my friend who worked there, I've been working with, got pregnant, so I got in through maternity leave cover. It's highly unlikely that I would have been able to go into a think tank like that normally, I think. And I think those things need acknowledging, because, you know, how do we use our power, and then how do we pass our power on? So yeah, that kind of hierarchy of people who get the funding, who get the airtime, who get the, you know, sort of listened to, really needs breaking down, and then we can build our trust from there, and then talk about, and which is why the intersection of movements is so critically important, even if it's not to do with land justice and it's to do with the, you know, police and crime bill. It's still the same movement, or, you know, disabled people's rights. It's still the same movement. It's about land justice. It has to be, fundamentally. So yeah, that would be my thing on trust. And I think that links to your question, Jago, about why we have to pursue this connection with ancestors and tradition, because it's about like the extractivism of our colonial behavior. That, you know, you hear people move here who are migrants, and one of the people we spoke about how her grandmother was able to make sure that her children grew up healthily because she could grow food. But now they live here, there's no access to the land to grow the food. And yet that stuff is really critically important. I mean, that resonates with me as well. Like my nana, when I was young, you know, having an allotment, it's like, even though she lived in a council house, it's like those things are really fundamentally important to understand. Because without understanding those things, then we can't really, I don't think we can move forward. Sorry, long answer.
No, I think that's good. There's a couple of things, maybe, I know this is I know this is not actually my job today, but maybe a couple of things I just want to add. Like, one is that the change moving at the pace of trust is very much taken from emergent strategy and Adrienne Marie Brown, and so it's just like acknowledging that phrasing is not necessarily our phrasing, but I think it's a really important one. And I think that the link to the narratives work, like we did this work, this Power in Place report, and then this work around With Land We Can, which I put a link in the chat a bit higher up. And I think one of the key things that came out of that was recognizing that, almost as Frances said, when we did the literature review, there's no shortage of great ideas about what a new land system might look like, but there is a bit of a gap around how do we get there, and that sense of needing to build a narrative for that change is something that just seems to have come out in a number of different places. So yeah, and someone asked about the Liverpool Land Commission. I was on the Liverpool Land Commission. There was some really interesting stuff there. I think the key thing was that it was set up by the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority. So it was set up by like a municipal area with some power and some clout. And actually that's something that England is kind of lacking. It doesn't have its own authority to think about its own land. And so I do wonder whether regional approaches could be a bit more fruitful and a bit more kind of connected. Like when you start talking about land at a national level, it can get very abstract very quickly. And I think what the Food Farming and Countryside Commission are doing national pilots and regional pilots of land use frameworks could also be a really interesting sort of way of pulling into this debate. So yeah, it feels like there's lots of things happening that are aligned and interesting. I'll go back to monitoring the chat now.
Okay, I'm gonna suggest that we move on to Bonnie. There's some really interesting stuff, so please keep going in the chat and respond to questions and things like that as well. So let's open the discussion. There's a lot of expertise and experience in the room. Just noting a point there about not wanting to idealise the situation in Scotland, and that, you know, there's still a lot of co-option of things by existing landowners, and yeah, we're increasingly, as it came up in the previous discussion, sort of seeing issues around land holdings for things like rewilding and offsetting, which are good things in themselves, but aren't really addressing kind of power and concentration dynamics. So yeah, lots of issues here. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Bonnie to share with us the work around the People's Land Policy.
Is my slides up now, Mark?
They are. We can see them.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. My presentation hopefully will fit in very nicely with what Frances has talked about. I think there's loads that we have in common, and I really see us being part of the same movement. So the title is Food Justice Needs Land Justice. I'm going to focus on food issues mainly because we are at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. First of all, who we are. We came out, the individuals involved in the People's Land Policy came out of the Land for Work conference, which I believe was in 2016, which also includes Shared Assets, Land Workers Alliance, all sorts of groups that are here at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. We were part of the policy working group of the Land Justice Network, And we continue when the Land Justice Network, which was set up after the Land for What conference, when that dismantled, we decided we wanted to continue work, and we called ourselves People's Land Policy because we're inspired by the People's Food Policy that I think the Land Workers Alliance and others had worked on. We are mainly London, but we've got quite a lot of links around the country and also abroad, especially Brazil. We're not funded at all. It's not a funded organization. I don't really like the word activist, but we're just sort of people who have been involved in campaigning around all sorts of issues for all our lives. It's part of our lives. It's what we do. So some have been involved in housing and community, some in food, some in planning. So we see ourselves as just one part of an embryonic movement. And as we discussed yesterday in the Theories of Change session, we feel that this is we need to be building this grassroots movement. So we want to see ourselves as one component of that. And really, even though we call ourselves as People's Land Policy, and we're aiming, part of the aim is for a Land Reform Act, really we would like to be part of building a much more, a big mass movement for land justice. So our overall aims is the idea of the commons, so that land should belong to and benefit us all. And the commons is also a process. So for example, what this means really is that everyone needs to be involved in making decisions about how land is used, and also the concept of land stewardship. So it's the idea that we need to be looking after the land, not just for today, but for future generations. So what we've been doing is the idea is that we frankly didn't know very much at all about a lot of the issues. We're not really experts in any sense. So we're basically trying to learn from others and really finding out what people want from what they want to change. So basically the question we've been asking is what changes are needed to the way we make decisions about land that would facilitate your own aims and goals. And Francis already said there's so many people doing work around issues that are fundamentally land issues. So it could be food, community, housing, environment. So what could we change just on a bigger level, I suppose, on the level of land that would facilitate their goals with regards to their particular campaigns and struggles? So what we've done so far is we've done some workshops on housing community, did a workshop at Land Workers Alliance Southeast Gathering a while back, and we've done a few workshops at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference. Over the lockdown, we started doing these seminar series. We did 10 in all. One was on land and ecology, one land and food, and then the most recent one was on the whole issue of participatory democracy, the commons, and movement building. We've also attended a lot of events, listening to learn what people think about things. Really learned a lot last year from the Oxford Rural Farming Conference because there's such a big international input. Action on Empty Homes meetings, London Mining Network, which we're actually affiliated to, John Muir Trust, Rewilding Britain. So basically going to things a bit also like Francis has been doing, going and interviewing all these different groups to find out what they're doing and what they think and what they'd like to see change. So for us, the next step is we're trying to update our People's Land Policy document on what we've learned so far. We're thinking of doing another seminar series on community with a focus on housing, green space, and decision making. And we also had this idea of maybe talking about the idea of local land assemblies, sort of following on the idea of citizens' assemblies. We want to be part of movement building with others, trying to think about what kind of common projects that would actually bring us together. We're also looking at the idea of a kind of mini manifesto to see, based on what we found so far, what kind of things people could actually agree on that maybe could form the basis of some kind of campaigns. Also some potentially an education project. And also we really need to do a lot more work to find out about a greater variety of people who are often not heard what they think about these issues. So I'm still not getting to the bit yet, but I just want to say a few things about our other seminars as background. Basically, we have land justice, which I would define as access and control, how land is used, who makes decisions. It has to lead to ecological restoration and planetary health, as well as social, economic, and political justice. So we have to, when I'm talking about the ideas for changes in the food and land system, we have to keep in mind there's got to have this background of we are in an ecological crisis. And for example, I mean, agriculture is estimated to be responsible for 10% of greenhouse gases. Here's a little information from New Zealand, who are actually saying, you know, looking at the fact that so much land is being used for cattle has been a real problem in terms of deforestation. So basically, we do have to look at the role of agriculture in the ecological crisis. So we need to consider reducing the overall amount of land used, because land may need to be released for other uses, and then increase the share, though, of agricultural land use for agroecology, especially more fruit and veg. So I would imagine that everyone at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference should not feel threatened by the idea of reducing the amount of land for agriculture, because really it's really looking at the industrial agriculture and expanding the agroecological sector. But there's also the potential for multi-use. So for example, you could maybe do some reforesting and at the same time have animals grazing within those forests. So basically, the point is we need to make sure that when we're looking at food and land, we're thinking of that we are in an ecological crisis. The other issue is this idea of we do need some kind of overview national land use strategy, but it has actually been created by people themselves. It's actually come from the ground up. And we have to recognize that conflicts are going to exist. Even if we have complete control of land, there is going to be conflicts between what we use it for. We might want to use it for the public good, but what public good? Conservation, food growing, social housing. We need to find ways of overcoming these potential conflicts between us, the people themselves. Liberal democracy is a completely inadequate political system, relying on electing politicians every 4 years. And these ideas, by the way, have come out of our seminars. They're not just my ideas, the people these are some of the points made to envisage new ways of making decisions. And one of the quotes from a group called Commons Rising. By commons, we mean people self-organizing to co-produce and co-govern resources that they recognize as important for their livelihood and that of the planet. Note their livelihood and well-being and the well-being of the planet. So we did the stuff on participatory democracy. So again, we got to keep this in the background. And this came out of a presentation that from people from Brazil, a part of a movement called Bem Viver, which means sort of like well-being. And it has to be sort of central to the way we make decisions. But it's not easy. I think one of the conclusions of the seminar series is how to make it happen is very, very difficult, because there's not equality in terms of making decisions. With people have different capacities, different times, available to be involved, etc. So we have to, it's a real struggle, and it's a transformative process. We need to, keep working on how to improve the way we make decisions. So land and food. Some of the things that then came out from all the work we've done is that we need more, if not all, the land, agricultural land used for agroecological farming. We also need to increase the amount and diversity of people involved in food, whether that's in the rural areas, peri-urban or urban. And this is also not directly related to land, but I can't remember in which seminar series, but someone came up with this idea of growers and eaters, and everyone's an eater. And it's not just a question of what benefits farmers and growers, but we also need to ensure that people are able to get good quality nutritious food that they can afford. Because often the kind of food that comes out of agroecological projects now is such that it's also often beyond the means of many people. And also there has to be an international perspective in this, that we should be able to feed ourselves rather than having to export exploitation to the rest of the world. But we really, any policies that we have, they really need to be supporting the struggles for food justice and environmental protection elsewhere. So what are some of the ideas? These are all ideas that have come from other people, and some of them are in fact a bit contradictory. I mean, because some are smaller reforms, some are bigger reforms. So, you know, this is what I'd like to hear, is what do you think about some of these ideas? And Francis has already mentioned it, but really one of the most basic demands I think everyone agrees with, we've got to know who owns the land and how it's used. It's very hard to move forward without knowing that. Also, if we are going to enable more people to get hold of land for agroecological farming, then we need to reduce land prices. So, because frankly, it's just unaffordable. Most people can't get hold of land. So we need to stop land being an investment, and there's all various ways of doing that. One way potentially would be to say that you can't actually have land if you're not going to use it for the public goods, for example, agroecological food growing or environmental benefits. So you can't just invest and buy because you're speculating. Also, at the moment, it's a bit of a tax break. And really, we need to make it generally unattractive for investors to buy up land. The question is how to do this. So a lot of the issues that people have looked at are things to do with ownership, size of farm. And again, people have different views. What are the mechanisms? How do we transition? So people have talked about using the tax and subsidy system. So basically you sort of keep the system we have now, but you change what's happening now really with the new agricultural reforms. So you use the system to change what people are doing. Or you could move to actually break up the large industrial farms. I mean, slide here is a picture of one of these huge companies that I came across. As you can see, they're actually an investment company. So they've got investments in London and their investments in farming. And these are the kind of companies that, you know, are investing in land. And, you know, there's a case to be made, well, break these up and transfer this land to smaller agroecological farms, or even you can keep the large farms. Some people disagree with having two small farms and say what you should move to is more taking over the large farms for agroecological purposes and using more of a cooperative model rather than the model put forward by the big private industrial farms. Another thing that people have talked about, very, very popular demand, is to really stop the sell-off of public land. This has to do with agriculture or housing or any issue. You know, land should be made available to people who are going to use it for some public benefit. Other things that have come up, ideas that people have come up with is, of course, community buyouts, county farms. These are all very popular and have happened, well, community buyouts in Scotland. More radical is actually compulsory purchase of private agricultural land. So if you're not actually using it for the public good, well, the public can buy it, you're forced to sell it, and it would be transferred to those who are going to do something useful with it. We know there's the ecological land co-op, which owns land and then leases it to small farmers. And we could expand this, but they'll need a lot of funding because, again, land is so, and this goes together with the price of land's so expensive, so they can't buy it. Or even more radical, that has been proposed, all land becomes the commons. and sort of based on this community ownership idea. This has to do with housing. This slide here, but really, I mean, the community or the public would own the land, and then there'd be leases for various activities, whether it be housing, whether it be farms, whether it be community gardens or whatever. So these are all ideas that people have come up with. And also, one of the other main aims has to be to increase the amount and diversity of people involved. So obviously, if you make land cheaper, more people who normally wouldn't be able to access land would be able to. But really, we do need to have a better education system, possibly a university of land stewardship that was funded, so more people who normally wouldn't be involved, who don't come from a farming background, would be able to go on courses, become involved in farming. More localized was there's too much reliance on volunteers, which limits, people who come from more working class backgrounds are unable to necessarily afford to be volunteers. They need to be paid to do to learn the skills of growing. And then this idea of community hubs that maybe would bring together more established traditional farmers with new entrants, and infrastructure to encourage the mixing of more traditional farmers with those coming from an urban background, maybe involving establishing farmers in doing some of the training. This was also a big problem. It's not necessarily to do with land directly, but we realized that you needed this huge systematic change, because the market, capitalism basically, is a real problem. There seems to be a conflict of interest between people growing food and people eating it, because obviously the way the market works is that growers want to get as much money as possible, and the eaters want the prices to be as low as possible. I mean, that's just how the system works. So we need to look at that and bring them both together, just both in terms of the buying and selling, but also culturally, to understand. People need to understand the position of those who are buying food and, poor borough of London, and people need to understand what farmers are going through. There was an idea of food hubs that you could create, where maybe a physical space where growers could come to sell the food directly to eaters. And these could also be places to meet, socialize, share, learn about food. And this links into the point about trust that people have been making, because people need to come together to build trust in a common space. We also, to ensure other ideas, you've got to make sure that land workers are well paid. So we've got the problem of land workers who are employed, they need the living wage, there's universal basic income, more union organization. Reduce the cost of housing and make it easier to live on the land, which is a real problem for many land workers. And there's huge inequalities in farm income between large and small farmers. Payments, have been, once you have a large farm and you're a rich farmer, you can become richer. And it's very hard if you're on a smaller farm. More support for farmers to access the various new payment systems, and also financial systems to make it easier for new entrants to get access to funds. Other ideas are having guaranteed prices to farmers. Then on the eater side, well, you need nutritious food for all. And some statistics for Newham in London. Really, people are suffering. And it's not possible to buy some of the veg boxes that are on offer, so really people are just, local markets, yes, they're using, but those local markets don't necessarily get their, it's not London Borough farmers market, which only certain people can actually afford to go shopping at. So basically, you need to reduce this is other options, reducing the price of food, government intervention in this pricing mechanism, because obviously farmers don't want lower prices. So you need to work out some kind of mechanism. Other options that people have suggested is, well, don't do that, but actually just increase people's incomes through various means, higher wages, great increase in universal credit, et cetera, or do things actually control prices charged by supermarkets to consumers, limit their profits, for example, which they're making plenty of at the moment during the COVID crisis. Also, ideas are to reduce the gap between selling food and people buying it. Again, more direct selling between growers and eaters, or another really quite very unusual idea that has come out is, why don't we make food production part of public services like health and education? So growers are paid a salary like other public servants, a good one, I would hope, and then people would pay for this service to actually eliminate the market, because that's what's happened in health and education. Health and education, the market's been removed, so that's considered a public service. So these are all potential ideas. The other key area is international. And these, again, ideas came out of our seminar series. You need to decolonize the UK's role in food production, which frankly is quite big, along with its role in mining and all sorts of other land control local communities. There's no point in just returning it to the big landowners just because they're local. It's, you know, the idea is the communities, and we've got many examples in Brazil, for example, of this sort of thing going on, and much more control of agro corporations on a number of issues. And also there's a problem of food being part of this commodities market, which means the prices can go up and down depending on financial speculation. All that's got to change. And don't contribute to climate change by importing products grown on deforested land. And we've thought that's fairly obvious. But again, the soya is imported from places in order to feed cattle. Apparently, it's even imported to feed pheasants on some sporting estates. We need to use more land for horticulture in the UK, so we're less reliant on labor elsewhere. And we need to learn from land struggles in the global south, because I think that's one thing we learned, is I just felt that in some of these countries, there's so much going on that really is quite interesting and inspiring. One of them is this Right to Say No campaign and the rights of nature, which is worth exploring. All right, so general points in my conclusion: land reform. It will be easier to change the food system if we have land reform, because there'll be less inequality, more access to resources, the idea of stewardship, use of land for the public good. Changes must involve everyone. You know, how do you do that? It's just really important. You know, so land use strategy, bringing people together, questions, debates about all these issues that I've talked about. What is the way forward? People need to be involved in discussing this, and we have to keep an international perspective at all times. So things to think about. What ideas do you think are good ideas? Other ideas you might have. We need a mass movement. It's not just enough to have a few good ideas, but the ideas, hopefully, we could mobilize. Another point, exactly what Francis was saying as well, that people are so much in their silos, even within the food movement. There's people involved in so many different things. There's so many divisions between different groups, and not to mention between housing, food, environment, etc. So we need to do things to have some way of bringing people together. Maybe the idea of a kind of mini manifesto that we could get a lot of different people from all sorts of different movements to support. And I'd already mentioned, well, I mentioned up here again, the idea of local land assemblies. So Francis said there had been some reluctance to go, which seemed like top down, but why not start with the kind of local land assembly where people in different areas are getting together to talk about how they think the land should be used. And then, of course, if there's any people who would like to help us develop the People's Land Policy, it would be, you know, we'd like to do that with others. So resources and contact, we do have a website where we try to put loads of stuff. All the seminar series were recorded, so all that information is there. And you can hear much more of the detail of what ideas the speakers came up with. And if you're interested in contacting us, that's the email address. So thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Bonnie. And there's an absolute ton of ideas and kind of suggestions and proposals within both of those presentations. I'm keen that you all get a chance to begin to pull the bones out of that, and we can't do that in a group of 80. So we're going to, unless anyone has particular points of questions of clarification from Bonnie, and if you do, please use the reactions button to raise your hand so we can see you. Otherwise, I'm going to suggest that we move into breakout rooms so we can all get involved in a bit of conversation around this. We're going to allocate rooms randomly, so it's just an opportunity to speak in smaller groups, and in a very general sense, just to reflect on these presentations. Are there ideas that have been presented here that you are really enthused about, or that you have experience of taking forward that you would like to see developed further? There'll be somebody from the team here in each of your rooms, and they'll make themselves known to you when you get into the rooms. They'll just be taking notes though, really. So self-facilitate as much as you can. Give each other time to speak. Bring in your own knowledge and expertise, and we'll have about 15 minutes or so. We'll come back just at about 15:15, so just over 15 minutes to share your responses and reflections in small groups. So I'm not seeing any hands up with specific questions, so we're going to groups now. I hope that those were useful discussions. They're never long enough, but certainly I'll feedback a little bit from our group, and then we can go. I'll sort of open it up, and if people have got kind of key things that they want to feedback a little bit in the last few minutes of the session, it'd be great to hear a little bit about the kind of headlines of those discussions. Certainly from our room, there was a lot of interest and kind of enthusiasm for the idea of like local land assemblies, and some discussion about what sort of scale those should be and the need for them to incorporate both rural and urban questions around land, and kind of the potential for learning from, say, the climate assembly processes that have been happening. But also a recognition that some of the changes that need to happen, whether that's on like regulating the land market or changing taxation regimes around land, need to happen at a national level. So how do you connect as a question, which we raised but didn't really address, around kind of how do you connect that like local deliberation and kind of desire to make change with the national levers of change, and so a question about that, and also the fundamental need for kind of information and for awareness, and the potential for that to be done at a local level. So the gathering of information about ownership and access and taxation and where the money goes and all that sort of stuff, in order to generate, the ongoing question of why aren't more people outraged about the current land system and the way that it works, and how do we generate that level of kind of interest and curiosity and outrage that might lead to that kind of engagement and change. So I don't know if anyone else from any of the other groups wants to jump in and share a little bit of feedback.
I can go if no one else
Thanks,
wants to. Sorry, Kate. Yeah, we focused a lot in our group on kind of just the well, the point you said about outrage as well kind of hits, because in a sense we were talking a lot about how it seems really hard even to get the low-hanging fruit of sort of publicly owned or council-owned land already, which you would think has some, you know, duty to have a public benefit. And what are the ways that we can come together across our different movements to kind of to work on that? And also the point was raised about, you know, the importance of getting people involved right from the very youngest ages to have that connection with the land and food. And maybe there's a bit more work to be done in kind of making that a similar issue in sort of youth movements, like youth justice movements, in the same way as there has been with climate change, to kind of get a bit of the more of the rage going about access to land. And I'm aware that like groups are already doing that, like Flame, but there probably needs to be even more on that. And yeah, maybe we kind of talked a lot on the same sort of issues, especially around council land, but I think the land assemblies thing is maybe a good way of kind of building that grassroots pressure, because there seems to be a bit of a barrier there at the minute to getting that.
Great, thanks, Kim. Kate.
Thanks. So yeah, a couple of things. We had a really interesting conversation. Obviously, there wasn't enough time for all of it at all. But two things that really jumped out for me were people kind of really liked this idea of food production being part of being a public service and people being paid to do that. But then we were wondering whether that conflicted with the idea of wanting more community ownership, like whether actually integrating food production as a public service would put more power in the hands of the large landowners, or is that a necessary step in order to kind of get further down the line in order to then think about concentrations of ownership. The other thing being about the role of regional authorities, that there are a number of combined authorities and regional authorities that are elected across the UK, but that aren't necessarily being held to account very well, but who are using the planning, you know, who are thinking about lots of new housing and stuff. And are there ways that the planning system, and Petronella was talking about the work that she's doing in the west of England on this, but like using the planning system to increase land allocated for food growing as well as housing, and thinking, are combined authorities potentially quite a clever place to be putting pressure if you have one in your area, because they are operating at a scale that makes sense for thinking about land. So those were just two things I thought were quite interesting.
Great, thanks, Kate. Tom.
Cheers, thanks guys. Yeah, we had a similarly really fascinating conversation in our group, and actually I think there was I guess an enjoyment from the ability to have a conversation in the first place, which I think was really welcome from everyone. Again, similarly, it's nice to sort of hear some commonalities between what's happening in other groups, and again, lots of love for the idea of land assemblies. I think what I found interesting as well is that we had a sort of nice discussion around, I guess, where it's appropriate and who should be sort of leading or delivering on these sorts of things, and I guess some hesitancy around central government taking a lead on this, and especially the sort of lack of trust. I know trust has come up a few times today, but lack of trust in sort of national government to do something meaningful here. So we explored things like, you know, how market mechanisms might be enabled to make change happen, and similarly we spoke about, I guess, the potential around I guess local COP coalitions being part of that as well, and how they haven't really engaged on land issues as much as they could have done yet, so there could be potential there. There was also, I guess, a sort of healthy reminder of a risk warning on this, which is that, you know, if you do try to make significant change, often means you come under attack. So, you know, we as a movement need to be aware of that. And it's not just, you know, the sort of, I think somebody was talking about some experiences in Central America, but also, you know, that does happen in the UK and close to home as well in a different form. So as well as sort of, you know, having sort of paramilitary attacks, you can have, you know, the example of the miners' strikes in the 80s as well, which we need to be mindful of. But overall, I think sort of really sort of positively to be having the conversation, and also yeah, some hesitancy on national government, and definitely a sort of positive on sort of local first here. So those sort of localized land assemblies seem to be yeah, taken on really positively.
Great, thanks, Tom. Dora.
Hi, yeah, we had quite similar conversations to a lot of the other groups, and we talked a lot about the planning system and kind of the decision-making processes, and actually quite a lot of overlap with what we talked about in the workshop yesterday about whether to prioritize kind of policy and sort of a top-down approach, or whether to focus on grassroots approaches. And we also talked about the barriers that happen when a decision on a local level might actually not be sort of popular, or might not actually be approved of democratically, because of the attitudes that people might have. And yeah, Simon was talking about an example of working with Gypsy and traveller communities, and the fact that securing land for those communities might actually in some local communities be quite an unpopular decision, and how do you kind of overcome those barriers on a local level. Yeah,
really interesting points, and kind of the kind of gaining of consent, I think, around some of this stuff is really an interesting question. Christabel.
Yeah, so in our little group, we talked about some similar things, but something that was a bit different was like where people got inspiration from. So Chiapas was mentioned as kind of like a success story of where land reform had. Another one was Rojava, with kind of participatory democracy and models that bring together kind of environmentalism and cooperativism and feminism in a really kind of what we might call intersectional way. And so potentially bringing that kind of thing into these land assemblies on a regional level would mean that they kind of worked in a horizontal way, and brought in really democratic decision making. So that was kind of one thing. People were quite excited about the idea of doing more horizontal organizing, which kind of flipped what seems to be competition for land into cooperation for land. So bringing together people from all different sectors and different communities together in these land commissions to do strategic planning, but then outside of that having movements that kind of connect people who wouldn't normally talk to each other. So that's not the only place that movement building would happen. And then one other thing that was talked about was like just having conversations. So the Right to Roam as a campaign is like one thing that people use to just start talking about land ownership. And there are other tools to do that. And then just like if you're in a rural area, talking to landowners, making those connections with landowners is another way to make land a thing, more of a thing in the public area. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks, Christabel. And Alana.
Yeah, so we also talked about like the tension between having management of land from like a top-down perspective, and especially the idea of putting food into the public sector. We're like thinking about what farmers would actually think of that, and we sort of in favor of diverse land systems that had lots of different structures, but with safeguards that like stop mass accumulation of land by any one person. Just the hesitation of mass sort of control of land. And then we were talking about sort of the difference between like kind of not being able to find, so like some people have land or know of land or can approach people who have land, and there are people who want land, but like there's no like we just talked about a matchmaking service, and that we need one essentially, because there seems to be a lack of communication between the two. Yeah, that's me.
Great, thank you. And thank you everybody for your input and participation in those groups. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to go a very quick final word back then to Frances and Bonnie in terms of your reflections on all of that. So Frances, maybe first.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a fascinating session and I've really enjoyed it. I wish we could have had more time, and I really wish we were all in person so we could have those conversations like in the breaks and things. They're always the really good ones. But I just really welcome having different people in the room with different perspectives. You learn something every time from what people are up to and what they're doing. And so it's not just the people who are presenting. Although Bonnie, I really, really enjoyed Bonnie's presentation and the work of the People's Land Policy. It's what everybody else is doing. And being able to do this at a farming conference where, predominantly it's about agriculture, and to bring in sort of ideas about being these whole kind of sessions where people are bringing in ideas about the intersections of like movements and land justice feels really, really important. So yeah, just thank you.
Thank you. And Bonnie.
Yeah, so really agree with Frances that what's most enjoyable is to really hear everyone's comments and conversations and ideas. And I particularly like that some of the points just about some of the tensions. And I think that's what it's all about. There are loads of tensions between groups and between the different proposals, and really that's why we need all to be in the same space to be having those discussions. I mean, like the point about, yes, the whole idea of making farming part of the public sector. What are the implications, and how does that fit with the ideal of community ownership? And how do we just deal with all of that? But we can't begin to deal with it until we're all in the same space talking to each other in a way that is not antagonistic, but, as someone said, moving from potential conflict to cooperation, because basically we all are all on the same side, and therefore we have to keep that in mind.
Brilliant. Great point to end on, and go to lunch, go back out into the world, go to your next session. Thank you everybody. Thank you particularly to Frances and Bonnie for your presentations and really stimulating thought and action, and thank you to everybody for your participation. We've got a ton of stuff in the notes from all of those breakouts, and I'm sure it gives us plenty to chew over as we go forward in the new year. So thank you.